Next, we're going to move on to our second panel speaker, who is Marcus Cordeiro. Marcus Cordeiro is an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Manitoba. He holds a PhD in biosystems engineering and has extensive expertise in agro-environmental modeling, statistical analysis of large data sets, spatial analyses using geographical information systems, and remote sensing. His multidisciplinary expertise has enabled him to work on relevant research at the national scale, such as the recent water footprint assessment of the Canadian beef industry, which generated science-based evidence about the environmental sustainability of the beef sector. And today, Marcus' presentation is entitled The Impact of Climate Change on Water Crop Demand, What to Expect in the Canadian Prairies.
Hello everyone, my name is Marcus Cordeiro, and I'm here to talk today about the impact of climate change on crop water demand in the Canadian prairies. So let me just flip to my presentation real quick here and project that for you. And actually the topic for this presentation came through a conversation with Dr. Mario Tenuta. And he reported being approached by producers and being asked, okay, you understand the climate change thing at global level, increasing temperature, but what does it mean for us here in the Canadian prairies? So this presentation was actually an attempt to discuss this topic or this question in terms of crop water demand. So we're going to have a look at a few studies here. We have a number of studies. The first one, it's a national level, very high level study here. And then the other ones below it address specific crops at specific regions. The one in orange is actually quite interesting, but we don't have time to cover this today. But I just included here in the table just for the sake of completeness. If people have interest, they can go back and have a look at this study, which is quite interesting because it includes 3 different crop models as well as 20 climate models. Okay, so when it comes to projections of the future, models don't necessarily agree. And this may be due to a number of reasons. The first one is the spatial scales at which the studies were conducted. So as you can see here, we have scales ranging from national to field, and this can cause discrepancies in the outcomes of the studies. Also, these studies use different crop models, which have different routines to simulate crop growth and crop water demand, and this can lead to differences as well. Maybe more importantly, the number of and the type of climate models used in the simulations. As we know, climate models don't necessarily agree with each other. In many cases, they disagree. So our approach to address this is to use a number of models and then to report the average. As you can see here from the table, we have studies using one climate model, sometimes up to 20. So this can lead to a drastic difference in the outcome. We also have difference in the period that you are reporting. For example, we have simulations running from 2020 to 2049, some others running from 2040 to 2065. So because we're reporting this timeline as a single number, these numbers may not agree with each other. And last but not least, the CO2 concentrations used in the studies. So we know that crop development is very responsive to CO2 concentrations as well as water use. So if we use different CO2 concentrations, we should expect different results as well. So the idea for today is to look at these studies at very high level and then try to draw some conclusions or see if any patterns emerge in terms of crop water use. Okay, so let's jump right into it. And the first study, as I said, was done at national scale, and it looked at forage and grain production. And for this presentation, just focusing on the Canadian prairies, you see the red box there. So in terms of temperature and precipitation, there's not many news here for us to discuss. So temperatures are expected to increase between 3 and 3.5 degrees Celsius, and precipitation is expected to increase between 5 and 10% on average, right, for the agriculture region of the Canadian prairies. When we're talking about crop water demand, though, it might be more enlightening for us to discuss precipitation deficit, which is the difference between how much water the crops will need to use as evapotranspiration and how much water is available for the crops through precipitation. The difference between the two is the precipitation deficit. So for perennials like alfalfa, what you see is, or expect to see, is precipitation deficits ranging from 51 to 100 millimeters in most of the Canadian prairies. When it comes to cool season crops like wheat and canola, we expect to see precipitation deficits ranging from 1 to 50 millimeters. And when it comes to warm season crops like corn, again, we see precipitation deficits ranging from 50 to 100 millimeters. Now, there's this other study that looked at forage and silage production in Alberta using a farm model. And what they found was that precipitation changes in the same range of 10% as you saw before. We saw crop water demand changing very slightly in the near future between 2020 and 2045, but this water demand is expected to increase much more substantially as we pass 2050. And this equates to a precipitation deficit that's actually negative. So we have a little bit of excess moisture between 11 and 22 millimeters in the near future, but that becomes negative between 4 and 15 millimeters as we go into the distant future. In terms of yield, though, what you expect to see is a substantial increase in alfalfa, mostly driven by CO2 concentrations, both in the near future and in the distant future. We also see an increase in corn silage, which is very expressive, and this is mostly driven by temperature increases. When it comes to barley, though, we have a little bit of a mixed picture here. So when you're talking about barley silage, we see modest increase ranging from 1.5 to 3%. And this is mostly driven by an overall increase in biomass. However, when you look at barley from a grain production perspective, what you expect to see is a reduction ranging from 3% all the way to 12%. So this is mostly due to a very fast maturity period that's reached in a very short period of time, doesn't have enough time to build that grain yield. So for the next study, which was done in Alberta at provincial scale, and it only looked at barley grain using the SWOT model. And at such large scale, what you see is a different picture between the north and the south. So in the north, we expect to see a decrease in water use despite increasing precipitation and temperature. And this is at first a little bit of counterintuitive because you expect to see an increase in water use as you have more water available through precipitation and higher temperatures. But this result is actually a complex balance between a number of variables, not only precipitation and temperature, but also CO2 concentration, soil moisture, and so on. In the south, though, what you see is an increase in water use that's mostly driven by soil moisture because precipitation is expected to decrease in southern Alberta. So overall, when it comes to yield, though, what we expect to see is yield increases ranging from 80 to 100%, depending on the CO2 concentrations or the RCP that are used in the simulations. And for irrigated barley, we don't expect to see much change because that type of production system is already at very close to the maximum potential yield observed for this crop. When you talk about yield production in the future, there's a study that was done in Swift Current in Saskatchewan. And first we look here at the water balance and climatic change. So maybe I'll just change my pointer here to a laser. And when it comes to growing season precipitation, what I expect to see is a slight decrease in the future when you have modest CO2 concentrations, moderate. And then as we move into more extreme CO2 concentrations, we have increases in the range of 10% as we discussed before. However, we will see increases regardless of the scenario. So there's higher water used by the crops, but there will be also higher, not as expressive, but still higher water available for crops to develop, especially at critical growth stages like maturity. Except in the near future here, the increase is not very pronounced. This all equates to stable water use efficiency. So the water with slight increases. So what you see is that crops will use water more efficiently in the future despite increase in water demand. And this study did something that's really interesting because they broke down the impact of each factor on yields, right? So here what you see, when CO2 increase is considered alone, we have yield increases ranging from 8% all the way to 16%. The impact of temperature alone is always detrimental. So we have impacts of minus 10% in yields all the way to minus 29%. When you look at precipitation effects alone, we have 10% increase across the board. And when you put this all together, we see yield increases of 8% for moderate CO2 concentrations, regardless of the timeline. And then we see higher yield increases as you move into the future with higher CO2 concentrations. There's also this study also done in Saskatchewan in a different location, and they looked at yield increases in the water balance for wheat, barley, and canola. And they looked at the water balance on a monthly time step. And what they found is that there will be increased precipitation on a monthly basis at the start of the growing season, except for August and September, which you have, it remaining relatively stable with small increase in August, and then a slight decrease in September. For temperature, we see the same picture here. We see increases for the first 4 months of the growing season, and then we have a decrease in August as well in September. And something they did really interesting in this study is that they broke down the impact of different variables on yield variability as you move into the future. They also consider input level like fertilizer rates, application rates, as well as how many crops were in the cropping systems. So we're not reporting those, we're just looking at precipitation and growing degree days. So what you see for wheat is that the impact of precipitation is not that large, it's only 14%, mostly during the beginning of the season. Then you have a high impact of temperature spread out throughout the growing season. For barley, we see an increased impact of precipitation, but temperature still remains an important variable here. And this contrasts with the picture for canola because we see that canola is not very affected by precipitation as much as it is for temperatures, especially in the month of June. But this study, though, it reports not very expressive changes in yield. So as you can see here, is slight increase in yield in barley, and as well as a 10% increase in canola. Even though it's not significant from a statistical standpoint, I think a 10% increase in canola is important from a producer and from a producer's perspective. So we should keep that in mind. Numbers can mean different things for different people. So for the last study we're going to discuss today, it was done with canola and it was simulated with conditions in Brandon, Manitoba. So what you find in this study here is that precipitation remains relatively stable. It doesn't increase as much regardless of the CO2 concentration scenario we were looking or the timelines. But we see a little bit of a decline here, especially as we move far into the future for more extreme CO2 concentrations. But these predictions in the far future, like approaching the end of the century, they become more uncertain. So we have to take those numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt. For temperature, we see a pronounced change in temperature, which is reflected on the heat accumulation for the crops to grow. As you can see here, the numbers start to grow drastically, and the number of days with temperatures that are high enough to cause water stress. So what you see here in this table is the heat stress index expressed for canola for different growth stages. And what you see is that those heat index tend to increase across the board, regardless of the CO2 concentration, the timeline, as well as the growth stage. So this reflects on the yields as a reduction in harvest index. The harvest index is the part of the biomass that's removed by harvest. So as you can see here, we have an overall reduction, which equates to yield reductions, total yield reductions ranging from 37 to 42% in the future. So this is what this study reports. You should expect yield reductions on average of 40% for canola as we move into different climates. So what can you gather from all these studies as we put them together? Well, the first thing is precipitation is expected to increase, but only modestly. And this increase may not take place during the growing season, according to some studies. We should also expect to see increased water demand And this is mostly driven by temperature increases. And the use of those crops will also increase, driven by CO2 concentrations. And as you saw there, different crops will have different impacts by the CO2 levels. We should see enhanced water use efficiency because crops will be able to produce more with the same water input. And as I said before, we should be careful and look at this with a little bit of suspicion, because the result that the study shows depend on the CO2 concentrations as well as the climate models they use. So we should keep that in mind as well. So here are the references for those studies. I've included the one I didn't discuss here, so I just want to leave this slide up for a few seconds so people can have a look at the studies. If you need to, please go back and refer to this one if you need to see the studies in more detail. And this is what I had for today. It's expected to be a very high level discussion about those studies, but I hope to have the chance to meet with you in the live section, the live roundtable this afternoon, and then you can discuss this in more details. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you during the live discussions. Thank you.